all welcome Miriam Bongolan. Okay. Can we extend the hand and pray for Miriam? Lord, we thank you so much for really charting a path for Miriam to be here with us. Thank you for touching her heart to say yes, not only to do the EMDR for our staff, but to say yes to be here to us tonight and share what you've been steering unto her heart. Father, I pray that you will anoint her lips and that she will have a sense that your presence is with her as she speaks, that you're standing beside her. Lord, I pray for a soft landing place into the hearts of people where her words can land into. In Jesus' name, we lift her up to you. Amen.
Thank you. Well, it's an honor to be with everyone here tonight. Welcome to everybody who is on Zoom. It's nice to see you on the screen. And thank you, everyone who's here in person. It's always an honor to be able to speak with people, especially those who have entered the journey of exploring painful memories and their traumatic experiences. This evening, I'm going to begin with giving an overview of the psychological or clinical aspects of trauma. And then we'll be connecting that to scripture and working towards understanding ways that we can receive healing and seek help to recover from these experiences. So we're going to start with the types of trauma. Now, trauma itself, of course, began in the beginning. When Adam and Eve brought sin into the world, with the sin came brokenness. And that brokenness affects all areas of our life, our relationships, our health, the way the world works. And it's because of sin that trauma even exists. So as we work through trauma, the first thing we want to remember is that trauma is a result of sin in the world. The formal definition of trauma is that trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event, such as an accident or rape or a severe natural disaster. For it to be a formal definition, there needs to be some kind of threatening experience, usually life-threatening or emotionally threatening. However, they have added that a person can have a response to an event that is perceived as threatening. So even if you weren't actually in danger, if you felt like you were in danger, that can be a traumatic experience for you as well. So you might be thinking, oh, I've never been in danger. My life has never been in danger. But there may still have been times where you felt threatened or unsafe. And those would also qualify as traumatic experiences. So we have two kinds of trauma. We have large T traumas. So these are the ones that qualify for the formal definition. Things like rape, war, natural disasters, attempted murder, severe crimes. These are very large, life-threatening, traumatic events. The majority of these will cause a person to have some kind of trauma response, some kind of trauma symptoms. So we call them large T traumas. But we also have small T traumas, which you can think of like a bucket of water. A small T trauma is something where you are experiencing something that makes you feel threatened, but it's not very big. Maybe someone has just betrayed you, or gossiped about you, or judged you, or yelled at you, and maybe it's not such a big deal, you think, but it's like a drop in the bucket. And if you get a lot of those drops, your bucket gets very full and you begin to experience trauma responses, even if it wasn't a life-threatening situation. We also have something called secondary trauma. This is very common for frontline workers, policemen, hospital workers, counselors, disaster response. This is for people who see somebody else's trauma or hear it. If you are hearing a lot of other people's stories of trauma, you can begin to have a trauma response because you are carrying their pain and listening to their pain and watching their pain. So, the last one, actually, the one I have the most personal experience with, is betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma occurs when people or institutions who you depend on for survival or who are very important to your support violate your trust or well being. When these traumas compound, they become more complex. For example, a person who has one single rape experience will have a big T trauma and most likely experience PTSD, which we will talk about in a little bit. But someone who has repetitive childhood rape experiences is now also experiencing betrayal trauma. And with the betrayal trauma comes a more complex version of PTSD that takes more work. This can also be seen in Christian institutions. Betrayal trauma is very common when our spiritual leaders betray us or make us feel judged or make us feel not accepted in our spiritual community. You can have a trauma response to that spiritual betrayal, which is what I experienced. My godfather, who was a missionary, chose to betray my family and not stand with us when we stood against abuse and continued to attack us for many, many years. And it's very painful when people you love betray you and when they don't honor what they've taught you. So, betrayal drama often can occur on a spiritual level, even if your life is not threatened. So, that's a brief review of the types of trauma, but my thing is not skipping. You can just go to the next one. So that's a brief review of the types of trauma, which are all treated differently, right? Just because you experience one kind of trauma, it doesn't mean there is one kind of healing process. But knowing what kind of trauma you've experienced can help you have a road map for where to begin your healing. Now, one area that has had a lot of research is an area called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or the ACE scores. These areas cover three: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Under abuse, we have physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Neglect includes physical and emotional neglect. And household dysfunction includes mental illness, imprisonment, addiction or substance abuse, domestic violence, and divorce. Now, research has shown that the more of these experiences you have as a child, the more likely you are going to struggle with trauma symptoms, both physically and mentally. So you might also, again, be thinking, nobody really hurt me, but maybe nobody really cared for you either. And you experience some kind of neglect or harshness. That's also going to be trauma in your life that needs healing, needs to be brought to the Lord. As we said before, biblically, trauma is rooted in sin. And I want to look at 4 ways that sin works in the world to traumatize us. The first is that sin is just in the world now. This world that was supposed to be good is now broken. And because it is broken, bad things will happen. These are not things necessarily targeted against you. They're just effects of a broken world. Things like a war or disaster, cancer, just your imperfections and not having everything go the way it should. These are all things we experience just because the world is sinful. And many of these things can harm us. But we can also be sinned against. So this is where we talked about betrayal trauma. People can betray us, or people who don't even know us can just hurt us. Rape is a terrible sin. against another person. Theft, slander, betrayal, any kind of abuse, violence, these kind of crimes are sins against a person. And these can cause trauma. When someone sins against you, it hurts. Also, we sin. We hurt ourselves. We make poor choices, we attack ourselves. But we also hate. We can slander, we can anger, we can gossip, we can backstab. And sometimes the trauma we carry is the things we have done, especially if you have war experiences. Sometimes in war, people do terrible things and they come home and have to live with the terrible things they've done. Sometimes when we're hurting, we try to solve our pain with things that hurt us more. And then we have to live with the effects of those choices we've made. We can hurt ourselves, we can traumatize ourselves. We have to heal from that as well. We can also be forced or caused to sin. When a person is raped, they did not choose to be raped. Doesn't matter what they were wearing, doesn't matter where they were walking, doesn't matter who they were dating. They did not choose to be raped. They were forced into that sin. When little children are being molested, are being coerced, are online and exploited, they are not choosing to sin. They're being forced to sin. So there are times we can be forced to sin, even exploitation. Someone has a gun to your head and tells you, you need to do this or I'm going to kill your friend. You may feel like you have no choice. You are being forced into sin. It's not always easy to know what is right. And there are times when we are actually forced to sin, and it's not our choice. And it's not just a sin against us, it's a sin we are forced to participate in. It's a different kind of trauma. Now, all of these kind of traumas have different effects, but we're going to generalize the majority of them. So the first thing we're going to see with trauma, a very common knowledge, is PTSD. This is usually in response to a traumatic event. Like one war would count as one traumatic event, right? One rape would count as one traumatic event, one theft. These kind of things would create a PTSD response. It used to be believed that PTSD was just severe anxiety, but it's not. It's actually a specific trauma response. And what PTSD does, or post traumatic stress disorder, is it makes you relive the pain you've been through. If you have times where you're going about your day and suddenly these terrible memories are jumping into your head, or you're feeling disabled by thoughts of something that's happened, or you're very anxious, or you're startled by sounds, these are all signs of PTSD due to a traumatic response. On top of this, we have CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. This is when you have had recurring or long-term traumatic abuse, usually some kind of childhood abuse. And accompanying the intrusive memories and the shock and the fears and the anxiety that PTSD has, you also have these intense feelings of worthlessness, shame, and guilt. Much of our shame and the guilt we carry today is connected to what we experienced as children. Because when we are children, we don't know what faith, hope, and love look like. We're learning it. We don't understand the definition of those words, so we're learning it. And when we are in an environment that shows us that love is harsh, or that faith is very controlling, or that hope doesn't exist, we grow up believing very different ideas about faith, hope, and love. And we have to heal even from our understanding of what those should be. So another important one, people with complex PTSD will also find they have a very difficult time with relationships. It's very hard to connect to people, to trust people. They have a hard time keeping friends and having faithfulness to their partners. Along with the PTSD and CPTSD, which are the most widely diagnosed conditions to trauma, are the long-term effects of the AC scores. So the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely you are to have depressive disorders or a pulmonary disease, asthma, kidney disease, stroke, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and obesity. All of these increase with the more childhood experiences of abuse you have. Now, if you have one of these, it doesn't mean you were abused. It just means that it shows us that what happens to our minds carries over to our bodies, and it does affect our bodies. So healing our minds brings healing to our bodies as well. So one thing we're always looking for is signs and symptoms of trauma. We're in a counseling, we're going to look at things and determine if it's a symptom of trauma or the problem itself. So there's a lot. There's the shock, confusion, anger, anxiety and fear, guilt, shame. And they're finding in research that any abuse involving sexual abuse has an exponentially larger degree of shame attached to it. There's withdrawing, the hopelessness, being disconnected or numb. We also have physical signs, insomnia, nightmares, easily tired, easily startled, difficulty concentrating, having a racing heartbeat, being edgy, having mysterious aches and pains, oftentimes chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and chronic pain are connected to past trauma, and then muscle tension. So if you have a lot of these going on, it's possible you have some unresolved traumatic memories that are causing some harm to your body. And we have additional symptoms of long-term abuse, most commonly seen from sexual abuse or chronic childhood abuse. So self-harm. Self-harm, sometimes people think of self-harm as a choice or as a problem in itself. Self-harm is usually a symptom of a deeper problem. It's a traumatic response to pain and shame. You also have suicide. There's a difference between the two. Suicide is thinking the world would be better if I was dead. Self-harm is thinking it wouldn't matter if I'm dead. The fact that I exist is the problem. And it's thinking I need to hurt. If I just make myself hurt enough, the pain will stop. It's a mask for other pains. Sexual promiscuity is a symptom, especially of sexual abuse. Often we look at young girls or women who are very sexually active or engaging in risky sex or very revealing in their clothes, and we think, oh, what is wrong with them? You know, they should make a better choice. But often that is a symptom of childhood sex abuse. Self-medication is a symptom. It's just an attempt. Self-medication is our kind word for drug addictions and alcoholism. Okay. We're self-medicating. It's an attempt to mask pain. So sometimes we think, oh, the problem is that you're drinking too much. Oh, the problem is that there is pain that you are trying to hide with the alcohol, right? Depression is a response to long-term pain. Lack of motivation. Many trauma victims appear lazy and like they don't want to do anything. But in reality, they can't find any reason to do something. There's no point in trying. Their trauma response is to freeze, so they just don't even try. And then anger and rage, we see this commonly in men, which also results in prison. Many men who are in prison are victims of childhood abuse. And their way of coping with it was to fight and fight and fight until they end up in prison. So those are some of the clinical and psychological effects. But now we're going to talk about the actual brain. So our brain is an organ in our body. It's not a mysterious cloud of mist. It has neurons and connections, and it's very intelligent. If you injure your brain, it stops working, correct? If you have a brain injury, your brain is not going to work as well anymore. So one of the things that research has been learning now is that trauma actually physically affects your brain. It's like having a car accident and getting a brain injury. Physical things happen to your brain. So, a couple things we're going to look at with how our brain functions is our interrupted narrative. So, I imagine if someone says to you, "Hi, can you tell me about your life?" You probably can think of a story about your life. Say, "I'm Miriam. I was born in the Philippines. I went to school here. I graduated and moved to America. I got married. Right? I have this story. And that's the story of my life." What traumatic memories do is they interrupt our narrative. Our story is going along and something happens and we hit it. And it's like, wait, what happened? And our brain doesn't know what to do with it and it kind of freezes and just goes around this problem and keeps going. The problem is anytime you're going through life and that moment comes back to mind, your brain hits it again. It's like, oh, we can't go there. It's too hard. And instead of that becoming part of your story, it becomes something you avoid, something you hide from, something you try to push down, something you try to forget. It becomes a burden, it becomes a shame, and it messes up your story. Now there's a block in your life that you have to keep away from everybody else. And this actually is a physical block in your brain. It actually messes up how your brain thinks. So you mentioned EMDR. EMDR is a therapy that helps remove these blocks from your brain so that you can experience your story smoothly again. And when your brain gets blocked, it can cause PTSD, anxiety, insomnia, the stress, the muscle pain. Many of these symptoms are caused because of your brain having this, I like to call it LSS, last song syndrome. It's just stuck there and it won't get out. And it keeps like annoying you and coming back and interrupting your story. So that's one of the effects that we can have on our brain from trauma. The other one is Bessel van der Kolk's work on how our body retains memory. Call it the body keeps the score. Our body remembers things we don't remember. Our body remembers the experiences we don't remember. And so we might feel like our body feels tight or hurts, or when we watch something on TV, we have a reaction and we're like, why is my body being like this? I don't understand. Because your body remembers the pain. Even if your mind doesn't, your body can remember. They found research has shown that in the womb and in early the first few months of birth, the body retains the experience the infant had. Right? A lot of attachment issues as adults are actually related to in the womb in the first 6 months of life. So they found through research that babies who have to be in incubators have long-term attachment issues. They were not with the mother, right? So the body remembers, the baby does not remember, but the body does. The body does affect how our brain works. Another one is children who have to be adults too soon. This actually rewires how your brain works with relationships. So what we mean is if you imagine you're driving a car, when you are a baby, you sit in the car. You don't worry about who's driving it. You don't worry about if there's gas. You don't worry about the map. You just sit there and somebody holds you. Nice. When you're a kid, you get curious. How does the car go? Can I drive it? When you're older, you start to learn how to drive a car. But you sit in the passenger seat and you watch and you learn. And finally, when you're old enough, you are taught how to drive the car, right? So when we are children, when we are babies, we shouldn't need to think. Someone just holds us. Then as we grow and become curious, we watch someone. How do you clean the house? How do you make a good choice? Then we start to learn that. And then when we are old enough, we start doing it ourselves. But with children who experience abuse, what happens is they go from being the baby to being the driver. They don't get to watch. They don't get to learn from experience. And they grow up too fast. And later in their life, whether they're successful or unsuccessful, they struggle with their relationships because they didn't watch a relationship grow. They grew up too fast and their brain did not learn how to connect with other people. And so you tend to be protective of yourself, avoiding other people, afraid of being hurt. And that's because your brain grew up too fast. And then long term child abuse actually alters your brain functioning. You take the MRI of a person who's experienced no trauma and the MRI of a person who has experienced childhood trauma, their brain is different. Your brain does not develop the same. And one of the side effects of that is that you as a child can get stuck in fight, flight, or freeze. Maybe as an adult, no matter what, you just run away, just run away. Oh, okay, I'm going to go. You're really nice. I'm going to leave. You can self sabotage. When you start to feel safe, you destroy it. You just protect yourself by keeping everybody away, you run away. Or your brain gets stuck in fight and you're just violent and angry and you don't know why, but you're going to be violent and angry and you're going to fight everybody. That's just the way it is. And that's your brain is just stuck. If someone stands against you, you become offended and you're going to confront them. Your brain is stuck in fight. Or you can freeze. It's a very passive, okay, okay. Your boss says, can you work overtime again this week for another 20 hours? Okay, okay. Whatever you say, yes, yes, because you don't know what to do. You just freeze. So our childhood traumas can have these actual effects on our brain. We fight, we flight, we freeze, and we don't even realize we're doing it or understand why our brain is doing it. But there is hope. There is healing. If sin brought trauma into the world, then the one who defeated sin is the one who can heal our trauma. When sin came into the world, before God even removed Adam and Eve from the garden, he said, there is a coming seed who will destroy the snake. In the very beginning, he promised that sin would not win. There would be hope. And even when he sent Adam and Eve out of the garden, he was protecting them because there were two trees in the garden. There was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God said, do not eat. There was a second tree, the tree of life. God never said they could not eat the tree of life. They just chose not to. But when their bodies became corrupted, what happens if this corrupted body cannot die? If you are always in a sinful body, you can never be with God. When they were sent out of God's presence, he said, lest they eat the tree of life. Why? If they ate the tree of life, they would never be with God. God's plan was to bring people back into his garden, back into his presence. His plan was always to heal the wound of sin from the very beginning. So when we look at healing, we're going to see that God has provided many ways for us to find healing. Some of the things we're going to think about is, are you treating trauma or are you treating a symptom? I like to say, if your arm gets cut off, would you like me to put a Band-Aid on it? No, that's not going to help. We need actual serious medical care, right? You know, if you have cancer, would you like me to give you a Tylenol? No, doesn't help. So if your bone is broken, be like, oh, your bone is broken. You're like, yeah, no, it's fine. I'm good. I don't need a doctor. Oh, you should go see a doctor. No, it's good. I don't need a doctor. I think you need help. I don't need help. I'm strong. I'm a strong person. I don't need help. Oh, but it looks like it hurts. Oh my goodness, it hurts so much, right? But we do that. Oh, you seem like you're upset today. No, I'm fine. I'm strong. I don't need help. We tend to look at these painful experiences and like, oh, it's okay. I'm going to pray today. It's wonderful. Pray every day. But sometimes it's just a Band-Aid because there's a lot more going on in your brain. Someone says to you, oh, I have really bad news. I accidentally cut off your leg. Oh, it's okay. I'll just pray about it. Okay, yes, pray about it, but also can you see a doctor, right? So when we're looking at our own lives, we need to ask ourselves, am I covering up a broken leg by putting a Band-Aid on it? Am I just using very simple little things to pretend everything's okay when I actually have something very serious that I should get help for? Another thing, well, I'll go back to that. One other thing on that. I already talked about it a little bit, but things like self harming, anorexia, uh, smoking, drinking. Sometimes we look at these sexual activity and say, oh my goodness, you're such a bad person. You're smoking. It's not very helpful because it's a symptom of bigger pain, right? So we also want to make sure that when we're helping someone, we don't look at their obvious problem and say, oh, that's what's wrong. I want to say, okay, well, what's going on? Good thing we always want to ask ourselves and others is tell me more. Tell me more before we make a judgment about what we're treating. We also want to talk about healing versus performing. There are so many programs. Do this 8-week program and we'll solve all your problems. Do this 6-week Bible study and you'll have no more pain, right? If you just do 40 days, your life will have purpose and you'll be great, right? So there's all these little programs. If you just do them, everything will be fine. Just go to church, just smile, read your Bible, pray. You'll be fine. You're not fine? Oh, you don't have enough faith. Just do more, right? That's like kind of how we operate. But what we're doing is we're looking at performance. We're not looking at healing. We're not looking for fruit. So it's out of a man's heart, out of his desires, that actions come. So it's out of what you've experienced, what your heart has felt, that your actions are coming. So when we talk about healing from trauma, you have to ask yourself, am I just performing for someone? Because I think if I do all of this, it'll take everything bad away. Or am I actually bringing my heart to God and giving him my pain and asking him to heal me? Because there is no healing in performance. There's no healing in performance. Then we have to ask, is it our brain or our heart? Sometimes our heart is sinful, but sometimes our brain is broken. And we need to recognize that. Maybe every day you wake up and pray that you won't be depressed. But the depression is still there. Maybe your brain is broken. Maybe every time you try to make a certain choice, you get paralyzed by fear and you can't do it because your brain is broken. Maybe you get so angry, you don't know why, and you've been asking and asking for God to teach you not to be angry. Maybe your brain is broken. Maybe your brain needs some help. It's not always your heart. And then sometimes it is your heart. We're also selfish, sinful people. Sometimes we are just choosing not to get better. But if you have been fighting for so long to get better, maybe it's your brain. Maybe we need to dig deeper and look further and stop judging yourself, but instead get to know yourself better. We also have healing called integration. So sometimes this is a topic that can get very confusing, especially in the Christian community. We have a spectrum of things that range from dissociation to dissociation identity disorder to schizophrenia, okay? And what these mean is that your mind isn't really your own all the time. And it's very important to know that this is not demonic. It's not a demon. Our mind is amazing. God made our mind able to handle pain. And one of the things our mind does is when the pain is too strong, it just shuts it out and blocks it off. And we kind of make another little part of ourselves that carries all that pain. So for people who have experienced severe trauma, sometimes you may feel like there's somebody who's not you. There's somebody else there in your mind, where there's so many things you can't remember. You don't know what's going on. Or people say you did stuff, but you don't remember doing it. You feel like there's another voice there. And then you're afraid, oh, maybe I'm possessed. If you're a child of God, it's impossible for you to be possessed. So that's not what it is. But we do know that your mind can break off. And you can't just put it back together. It takes therapy to put it back together. Also, when we're children and we experience these things, we can grow up, but the child version of us doesn't. It's something very often we can feel like, oh, I feel like I'm doing so great and I'm doing so well. Then I remember that little girl version of me and I just break. and I suddenly feel. Or I remember that little boy, and he was just so weak, and I just can't even think about that little boy. It's a part of us that we're leaving behind, and we need to bring these broken parts of us into relationship with God. And so we call that integration. It's a type of therapy that also helps heal things that are broken in our brain. Another question we ask is forgiving God. Now, obviously, God has done nothing wrong and we do not need to forgive him. But sometimes we need to remove spiritual beliefs that separate us from God. And this can feel like forgiving God. If you were abused by a Christian, you may believe that God is evil, that he is cruel, that he wanted you to be hurt. If you are part of a church that tells you, oh, God planned this for you, you may feel like God has meant to hurt you and wants to hurt you, right? You may have these beliefs that make God seem like the enemy. And part of your healing process is learning to accept that that's not who God is. In a way, it's forgiving, not forgiving God, but forgiving how you see him and learning to accept the love and grace he offers. Back again, it's Jen. And then another big one is you have to determine in your healing, are you dealing with shame or are you dealing with guilt? There's a difference. So shame is something that makes you feel dirty. Guilt is the burden for that sin. If you are raped, you feel shame. You have been made dirty. But you don't hold the guilt for that rape. It was not your fault. The person who raped you is guilty. You are not guilty. Oftentimes, our shame is made worse because we cannot speak about the things that give us shame. Shame is to hide, it's to be silent, it's to keep things to yourself. If you have been abused or hurt and you were told, shh, don't tell anyone, you will have shame and it will grow because shame thrives in silence. And you can put on a good face and you can go to church and you can worship God and you can say everything is fine, but inside you feel dirty. You feel like you are going to contaminate whatever you touch. You have that shame, but it's not the same as guilt. You can have guilt for the sins you have committed, but you do not carry guilt for the sins done against you or the sins you were forced to do. You are not responsible for that guilt. But oftentimes, victims, they take all of the guilt and the abuser walks away with no guilt. And the victim carries both the shame and the guilt. But you don't need to carry the guilt, just carry the shame. Right? Then we have the cyclical nature of healing. You know, you heal in a circle. You don't heal in a 6-week program. You don't even heal in a Living Waters program. You don't go, oh, I'm going to do this program. I'm going to go from A to B and I'll be great. You will be great. And then next year you'll go all the way back down. You're like, oh. And so you climb up again. And then the next year you go all the way back down. And you think, what is wrong with me? I was doing so good. Now I fell again. I failed again. Why can't I get better? Because it is not the nature of man to be perfect. That is what the story of redemption is in the Bible. What do we see? Adam and Eve fall, but Adam names Eve the mother of the living because he still believes in God, right? People fall. God sends a flood when Noah rises up. The Israelites sin. God sends a judge. They rise up. They sin. There's a judge. They rise up. David falls terribly through rape and allowing incest in his home. He experiences all the consequences of that, but he still rises up. He's still a man after God's own heart, right? That's what we do. We fall and then we get up again. Our healing is not measured in how high we go, It's measured in how quickly we come out of the pit again. Maybe last year when you started drinking, you were drinking for 6 months. This year it was only 5 months and 28 days. Good job. That's healing, right? Maybe the last time you were depressed, it was for a year, and this time it was only for 8 months. Yeah. The last time you got angry, you broke a chair. This time you just stomped your feet, right? It's not about how high you go. And as we grow, whether we have trauma or not, we're growing like a yo yo being used on stairs. So if you imagine you're walking upstairs and you have a yo yo, the yo yo goes up and down, but it gets higher and higher and higher and higher. We were never promised perfection on this earth, but we were promised growth. Sometimes I work with people who feel like they have no growth, that no matter what, they are terrible people. They tell me, I've been praying, I've been asking God, and I keep making this mistake over and over. And you know what I say? And you never gave up your faith. You've never given up your faith. You've fallen and you've fallen and you've fallen and you still come back to the Lord. That is faith. I often tell people I'm working with, if you have no problems, it's easy to trust God. But you have so many problems and you trust Him anyways. That's where your growth is. You struggle, but you haven't given up on the Lord. That is faith. It's beautiful faith. You need to recognize that. You need to understand how you're going to heal, or you won't ever heal. So, in the beginning, trauma came into the world, and we find rest from it in the garden. First of all, Christ is our refuge from those who sin against us. We can rest in Him. No matter what pain we receive on this earth, it cannot separate us from God. It cannot change how much He loves us. It cannot change the fact that He sent His Son to die for us. And it doesn't change that He promised that one day He will heal all of our suffering. Right now it's hard, but we know that Christ is our refuge. One woman asked, where was God when I was being raped? Why didn't He do anything? It's a good question. Another question we can ask is, why doesn't God stop every car accident? Why doesn't He cure every cancer? Why doesn't He provide everybody with enough food to eat so nobody starves? We don't expect God to stop every car accident. We don't expect Him to heal every cancer. We understand that there will be pain in the world. When we experience pain, it is not because God has abandoned us, but He has allowed it. So you ask, where was God when I was hurting? He was weeping. He was weeping with you and counting your tears. And He's promised to heal them, and you will be safe in Him. We also find healing when we remember that Christ has paid the price for our guilt. Every sin we have committed, He has already covered. He has already paid for. He has already recognized. He has paid all of our debt. We don't carry that guilt. If you are walking today carrying the guilt of your pain, you don't need to carry it. Christ has already taken it. I know it's not that simple to let it go. It takes time. It can take counseling, can take therapy, can take support groups. But that truth is there and you can claim it. No matter how long it takes you to feel it, you can know it today, that you don't hold that guilt. And Christ is our righteousness. We cannot contaminate Christ. When Christ died on the cross, He clothed us. Now, when Adam and Eve sinned, they tried to cover themselves. They made clothes out of leaves, but it was not sufficient. So what did God do? He killed an innocent animal and shed blood to cover the shame of man. to show us that one day Christ would shed his blood to cover the shame of man. And Revelation tells us that one day the bride and groom will be reunited, and the groom will clothe us in garbs of white. All of our shame will be gone, and we will be the pure, acceptable, and delighted bride of Christ. He has promised that. Shame, I think, is one of the hardest things to let go of, and it can hold us in so many areas. It can be anything from getting an F on your math paper to carrying the burden of sexual sin. Shame makes us feel almost like we're just covered in a black goo. And if we reach out and touch someone, we might make them dirty too. Just keep everybody away because I don't want to make anybody else dirty. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the woman who was bleeding for many years. I love it because if you were bleeding back in the day, you were not allowed to join in worship with the Lord, and you were not allowed to be around other people. You were considered unclean. This woman had spent so many of her years unclean, unfit to be with other people, separated from worship with God. And if anybody touched her while she was bleeding, they would also be unclean. She goes into a crowd and she touches Jesus. You know what? Jesus does not become unclean. She cannot contaminate him. Instead, his righteousness pours out and heals her. And he does not say to her, "Why did you touch me?" He says, "Who touched me?" Who? And she came forward and he said, "Your faith has healed you." He did not say, "Why did you touch me? Now I'm dirty and I can't go heal this other girl," because you can't make Jesus dirty. You can't contaminate him. When you come close and touch Jesus, he makes you clean. There is no shame, no sin you can have that contaminates him, but he will make you clean. And we find our healing and resting in knowing that Jesus has covered our shame and that we can't make him dirty. So, like we said, the pattern of man is to rise and fall. We go from glory into glory. We're not to attain it now, but we will grow in glory now. And as we are all healing cyclically, one thing we need to rest from is performance goals. Oh, if I can just be good enough. One of the most common things a victim will say is, "Am I good enough? Did I do enough? Have I redeemed myself?" You can't redeem yourself. You don't need to. Christ already did. But we ask always and always, "Am I good enough? Did I do enough? And if I just do all of these things, then I'll be clean, then I'll be okay." No, you don't need to do any of that. You just need to come and rest in Jesus and stop expecting yourself to have these great healing goals. And instead, find your healing by resting in Christ rather than in what you can accomplish. And God knows how our brain can break. Since he knows how our brain can break, he also knows how to fix it. And by his grace, research has introduced many ways that we can physically heal our brain, such as EMDR, which helps your brain process physically from past traumas. And there's other methods as well. And even like medication for depression. It's a way that helps our broken brain. God knows our brain is broken. He's also teaching us how to fix it. Sometimes we need to give ourselves the grace and take ourselves to a doctor, to someone to get help, and stop powering through the pain, limping along, saying, "It's okay, I'm a strong person." Yes, you are a strong person because you're fighting so hard, but you don't need to be so strong. Because Jesus wants you to rest, not fight. And of course, he also offers us future rest. We know that no matter what happens on this earth, we have the promise that one day all our pain, all our tears will all be washed away. and we will be in the presence of God, pure and clean, delighting in Him back in the garden, back with Him with no barriers. That is our destiny. The journey now is hard, and healing is hard work. But we don't ever give up, not because we fight not to give up, but because we're resting in the promise that this is not our destination. There is a better destination waiting for us. Healing is a journey. It's a journey that requires much rest, resting in the Lord. That is all. Thank you.
We'll entertain questions from you, but first we'd like to pray for.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for all of the beautiful people here tonight. We know that everyone who is here tonight has taken many steps or even just their first step towards healing. We know they've said, Lord, I hurt and I need help. And we pray that for all of them, wherever they are on the journey tonight, that you would help them know that they don't need to fight so hard. They can rest in what you have done. And they don't need to judge themselves because some things are out of their control. And that they don't need to be ashamed because they cannot contaminate you. Lord, we pray that you would help everyone here to experience your grace, your cleansing, your unconditional love for them, that they would know no matter how much pain they have in their past, that you were there with them, holding their tears, and you are here tonight, willing to sit with them, to listen to their pain, and bring them into a healing journey, Father. We thank you for your grace, both spiritually and physically, as you provide for healing in all aspects of our life. And you thank you for bringing your people together to share their stories and to encourage one another, Lord. In your name, amen.
We're now opening the floor for any one of you who would like to ask questions. Also online, we will get your questions. You can type the questions on the chat box, and Patrick and Jennifer will send us the questions. Okay. Sige. Si Fe.
We talk about, you mentioned that we should not suffer that long and that the journey that requires much rest. Then I have a friend. They are of a Christian family. Some are missionary, and one of his sibling, when their mother died, parang she started to have this depression and became ill. So the Veterans Hospital is just her second home. So you know what I mean? So she had a mental illness. She became schizophrenic to the point that she had this what it is, electrocuted, no, when she's on the height of her illness. So many years ago, until now, she doesn't recover. And there is another woman, a Christian also, good writer, but when she had this, what is this, yung, mental hospital is just her second home. So I know again, Christian, like, so, upon seeing them, upon knowing them, you know, I know them. So I was really asking the Lord, is healing for them also applied? Then why is their suffering too long, as if you're coming soon and that they are not yet healed? So no, I'm so what is this? So disappointed. So, and of course, mental illness, even in the churches, parang we have, they are not, I mean, even church cannot offer help for them. And even if they are in a hospital, of course, they cannot be treated. And if you bring them even in the Christian psychiatrist, if they do not know healing such as this, so they cannot be of help also to them. So this is a cycle of their suffering. So what can you say about?
Well, currently only 20% of psychology programs focus on trauma, right? So it's not actually a required portion of most psychological training because we've only learned what we've learned in the past 20 years, and a lot of it is still being studied. So what's happening now is we're starting to understand how to help people heal from trauma like the death of a loved one. But we didn't always know how to do that. Right? 20 years ago, psychologists didn't know how to help somebody heal from trauma. We were still learning. EMDR is only 20 years old. Vessel's work on body keeps a score only came out in the past like 5 years, right? So we're learning so much and we can't understand God's timing. But 80 years ago, if you had cancer, there was no hope. Now, if you have cancer, there's hope. So 20 years ago, if you had a mental condition, there is no hope. But now there's more hope. So even though it's hard for us to see people who have suffered for so long, we know that the world is growing, that God is using research to help us learn how to help people better. And as we learn how to help people better, we can walk along with their suffering. But we also know that sometimes the brain can be so broken it can't be fixed. Just like sometimes cancer can't be healed. But we can still love people and know that God is walking with them even through their suffering. I don't know if that answers your question.
Follow up, is EMBR a treatment for brain?
It's
Is a diagnosis what?
it is a physiological therapy. Um, it's a treatment for the brain, but it can't cure everything. It specifically works with traumatic memories. Okay?
Do we have it here in the Philippines? The EMBR?
Yes, there's some, and also me.
Okay. Okay. Talk to you later.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Are there questions online?
Hi, so here's one of the question online po. I think this person just needs clarification. Uh, this person is asking, bakit daw po magiging eternally separated sina Adam and Eve pag kinain yung fruit of the tree of life? Eh di ba tree of life po yun?
Yes. So what we know is that if they ate the tree of life and this body didn't die, like you don't leave it. So it's I mean it is not a doctrinal statement that you'd find in the creeds, but it's a very good illustration of God's protection by not allowing us to have to carry the sin that's in this body or the brokenness of this body forever. Because we die and it's through death that we become Christ. It's through leaving this body and he gives us a new body. So it's a protection that we don't have to carry that body with us. If that clarifies.
And then, thank you po. And then there's another question here online. This person is asking is, do you offer free counseling for traumatized people and those who have mental illness? Again, I think the person is asking, what are the resources? I Yeah. So perhaps you could like what are different sources to heal from
Right.
trauma?
So I really recommend if you're new tonight that you start by joining a Living Waters support group or doing their program because it's a great way to begin your healing journey. But if your journey through Living Waters, you've graduated and you're still dealing with residual effects of trauma, then that's the time you might want to look into new resources such as EMDR. I am an EMDR therapist, and I know that Pastor Benji doesn't like this, but if you are a victim of trauma, I don't charge. I just ask for my expenses to be covered. Yeah.
Hi, good evening. You mentioned something about um, some people who have trauma, and that what they do is that they become strong, and then they say that they're praying, they're reading the word, uh, they're basically looking onto God. But sometimes that's not enough, right? So I'm a bit late. I'm sorry. So why would you think that is, and what do you think these people are not doing or doing wrong, or what are they lacking in terms of, because maybe it's not about faith, right? So, and I think it's a misconception, right? So maybe you could talk a little more about that, and maybe at the latter part somehow you mentioned about it being a cycle. I think it's the first time I've heard of it, but I can somehow relate to it, because people really are not perfect, and sometimes especially in romance you have this the sinful nature, what you want to do, you can't do, but what you don't want to do you continue on doing. So there's this struggle, right? Maybe if you could just talk a little more about that, more on the first point, on why is that not enough, why is faith not enough, and what these people are doing wrong. Thanks.
So it's definitely a misconception that people who suffer from trauma don't recover because they don't have faith. That's not true. People who are suffering from trauma and still have faith have some of the strongest faith I've ever seen because they don't let go of God, and they have the strongest appreciation of God's grace because they know what sinners they are and they don't stop receiving his grace, right? So yeah, if you're struggling, it's not always a faith issue. And it is true that faith is not enough, but we want to be careful. Is faith enough to save you? Yes. Is faith enough to heal you someday from all pain? Yes. Like the work of Jesus made our faith effective. But we have to go back again to the fact that people are also very complicated. God made people incredibly complicated. And sometimes we forget that. If we look at our heroes in the Bible, they are so complicated, right? I mean, we like to talk about Esther and her romantic story with King Xerxes, who virtually raped her to decide whether or not he wanted to marry her, right? We forget about that. And then, he could kill people, and she was so brave. Like, talk about trauma, right? We talk about David, the man after God's own heart, who raped someone else's wife and then killed the husband, right? Whose daughter was raped by her brother, and David said, sorry. And the Bible tells us something very important there. He says that Tamar, after she was raped, she went to her father David. He did nothing. And she remained in her father's house desolate for all of her days. The Bible just gave us permission to be desolate over trauma. It's there. We look at David, so many of what he was doing was trauma responses. Why could he not respond to his daughter? Because he also had abused women, he could not see it, right? Why did he have to drag Mika away from her crying husband, right? Because he needed to prove that he was the one who should be her husband. Why does he get angry at Nabal and decide he's going to go kill him? And Abigail says, stop, Lord, this is not what God has for you. He's fighting. The younger brother who's never appreciated is fighting, right? But then also he doesn't kill Saul, right? And then also he writes these beautiful psalms about pain. David is often looked at this amazing man of God, but you read the words he wrote, and every psalm is, oh Lord, where are you? Why am I hurting? Why are things not okay? Why is everything falling apart? Why are my enemies around me, God? Right? And through all of that, he says, but even so, I will trust in you. That is what a trauma victim is doing. Lord, why is everything falling apart? But even so, I will trust you. You are having faith like David, even though there's very big lows. We also know that some of the practical things that can stall our healing is not being allowed to talk about it. If you have not been able to start sharing your story, you're not ever going to heal. healing comes in speaking. God wrote the story of humankind. He gave us a Bible, and instead of giving us a whole book of Leviticus and rules, he gave us stories, right? He's given you a story, and speaking your story brings healing. That's one very important thing. The other thing is having a healing community. God made us to work in community. When you have people around you who can hear your pain and love you, that helps you heal. And another one is, of course, sometimes your brain is actually not working right. And then you do need to pursue some deeper trauma therapy or trauma counselings to help get you unstuck and move forward in your growth process. I hope that answers your question.
Thank
Yes.
you, Miriam. There's another question here online. Actually, there's a few, but I'll just read one of them. This person is asking, I have suffered abuse since childhood from a borderline parent. I am going through a lot of therapy now and recovering. However, every time I encounter my abuser, I regress and go to PTSD again. Can you please give me some suggestions how to overcome? Is it good to engage or detach?
Right. So I don't know your whole story, so I can't really speak authoritatively into it. But I will say there is a lot of wisdom in having safe boundaries. There's this really cute proverbs says a fool returns to his vomit like a dog, right? A fool returns to his folly like a dog returns to its vomit. And we kind of have this idea that if something is bad for you, don't go back to it, right? When we are talking about people who truly have a borderline or narcissistic personality disorder, we really do re-victimize ourselves by pursuing the relationship with them because they're not going to change and they're not going to feel remorse and they don't have any empathy to care. Right? So sometimes it's good not to return to the vomit. Sometimes it's good to have a boundary, but we also know that God doesn't call us to be vengeful or spiteful. So if you make healthy boundaries to keep someone out of your life for your own healing, you need to make sure you do it because you know it's what's going to help you, and don't do it because you are angry or bitter. Because any action out of anger or bitterness will just breed more pain. But an action out of trusting that you need a healthy boundary for your own healing is sometimes very appropriate.
Thank you po. May a few, kuya. A few questions. So, okay, for those, here's another question, Miriam. For those who have been traumatized by losing a loved one, how crucial is the grieving process in their healing journey?
Very crucial. Loss is a heavy thing, and I can speak about this a bit from experience. My first daughter died 2 months after she was born. It was, of course, very devastating. But when she's 6 since she was born. We spent most of the time in the hospital, and when we brought her to the hospital, and she was dying, and they were resuscitating. I kept saying, I need to pump milk in case she needs to eat. Like, she's not breathing, but I had to go pump milk. And I would go pump milk just in case she's okay. Like, she might need to eat. I need to pump the milk. And that was a lot of the denial phase, right? I still need to be a mom. I'm going to go do this. I need to feed my baby. It was like this fighting and denial for it. And then when she died, it was like, oh, okay, it's gone. Like this just blank feeling. Then I got home and I saw the crib in my mother's house. And I collapsed on the floor screaming that I just want my baby back. Why can't I have her back? Then I go to a mall and I see someone else with their baby. And why did they get to keep their baby and I didn't keep mine? And then I find out I'm pregnant. And every night I have a nightmare that that baby is dead. And for years, I think maybe I'm just going to be a mom who has babies who die and I never get to see them grow up. Right? But then 5 years later, 6 years later, I talk about my baby and I cry because we never stop feeling pain over what we've lost, but we grow bigger around our pain. If you are grieving someone, you have about 2 years before you even need to think about moving on. You are allowed to cry for a long time. And everybody grieves differently. For me and my husband, we got pregnant so quickly that we didn't even have time to wonder, should we try again? But for other couples, when they lose a child, they can carry that wonder, should we try again? Should we try again? What if we don't have another one, right? For some people, we can lose a loved one and think, you know what? They're with the Lord and I'm okay. We move on. Other times we lose a loved one, we're like, my gosh, this one is too heavy. I can't do it. And every day it feels like you're dragging a sack of rocks, this loss. You don't ever have to stop missing that person, but you will grow around that pain. And when you think about them, you'll miss them. It's good. It's good to miss someone, but you'll also grow in comfort and you'll continue to live life. So all of the stages of grief that people talk about, denial, anger, they're good to go through and recognize. They're cyclical. They go in circles. It's not a line. Like you go through them over and over. But we come back to the same thing we always come back to. Even so, Lord, I will rest in you. Even though I miss this person, I will rest in you with my pain. And it doesn't matter if you miss them for the rest of your life. Best advice I got when I lost my baby, my grandmother had also lost her baby. And I asked her, her name is Mumu. I said, Mumu, when did you stop missing David? She said, I still miss him every day. I said, oh, it's okay to miss my baby every day, and allowing yourself to miss them every day makes the process easier. Because again, not performance expectations, right? Being gentle with yourself. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up on that. What do you tell people who will say, you've been grieving for more than a year now, you keep on crying, you keep on missing that person, move on. And what do you say to that?
And do you have any other words of comfort? Yeah, I'm a little bit snarky. I can have a strong personality. I a lot of people, I wasn't very active on Facebook, so a lot of people didn't know what happened. And one person came up to me and was like, oh my gosh, I saw about you losing your baby. It was so hard for me to read it. And I was like, oh, really? Was it so hard for you to read about my pain? Do go on, right? People don't know what to say and they feel uncomfortable around pain. So the easiest thing to say is, oh, just get better. You're fine, right? You're fine. Because what they're saying is, I don't know what to do. I feel uncomfortable. So I'm just going to say something easy, right? So usually when someone would say something to me like that, I'm like, okay, thank you. And just put it out of my mind because they don't know what to say. They don't understand.
Meron pa po. Okay, so Miriam, here's another one. Why do some people tend to sabotage things they have worked on or for? Self-sabotage, ika nga.
That's the flight response to trauma. Right? With relationships, if you've been severely hurt and traumatized in the past, love can actually burn, right? So you say that love feels like fire. Love and acceptance hurts. You don't know how to accept it, so you destroy it. Sometimes it's the fear of being noticed, right? Because you want to be invisible. You don't want anybody to notice. You don't want to get hurt again. And when you start being successful, people notice you. Like the ACE scores were actually discovered because of a weight loss program. Many of the people couldn't lose weight. And through their research, they found out they couldn't lose weight because they started being afraid that losing weight would draw attention to them, right? So they sabotage their weight loss to be safe. So it's generally a protective measure. You sabotage because you're trying to protect yourself from being noticed, from being seen, from failing, from being hurt. So it's really I mean, it's self-harming, but your attempt at self-harming is again self-protection.
Thank you, Miriam. One more question, Kuya, online. Um, this person is asking with regard to betrayal trauma that you mentioned earlier. Uh, how can someone start healing with this kind of trauma?
It's a little bit hard to answer. It depends on where the betrayal comes from. Um, one of the biggest dangers with betrayal trauma is often it's within your community. So there's no opportunity to talk about it. And often when you talk about it, people say, oh, you're making chismis, or you're making away, or just forgive, be at peace, reconcile, right? So it's very difficult to start the healing process if you are still in the community. So one of the first steps is you don't always have to leave where you were betrayed, but finding a group of people who will understand the pain and who will let you talk about it without judging you, right? So always one of the first steps, regardless of the trauma, but especially in betrayal trauma, is finding a group of people who can hear your story and say, yeah, that person hurt you. That wasn't right. And finding people who will validate you instead of people who will accuse you further. That's a good place to start with that.
Thank you. That's it for for the online for now.
Is this effective for a healing the trauma, the biofeedback?
Biofeedback has been found effective in healing trauma. Yes, I do not do biofeedback, but it is effective.
Hi, Miriam. So last question. So you talked about people who acknowledge their trauma, like people who know about their trauma and want to seek help. But and for example, you would know how to handle people who acknowledge their trauma. But for the normal people like us, how would you say if we have someone that we see who has trauma but is in denial? The one person that you mentioned that I'm strong, I can handle it, but they're making up stories in their head that is reinforcing the trauma in their own mind.
Mhm.
So, like, for the normal Joe, right? How would you, like, what would you say can we do for normal people, for those people who are experiencing that type of any trauma for that matter?
Right. So I actually do a whole seminar on being a trauma informed community that can care for people with trauma. Um, so hard to answer in a minute, but one very little small thing you can understand about trauma is often with trauma comes a negative belief about yourself or a misunderstanding about something. So maybe they don't know what love is like, or they don't know what hope is like, or maybe they think I'm worthless, I have no value, right? The best way to combat the untruths in someone's life is to live the truth by being a faithful friend, by being patient with them, by praying with them, by being kind, by encouraging them, by not telling them, oh, get better already, but by saying, it's okay, take your time, by being a person who can be trusted and teaching those values of faith, trust, hope, love, and faithfulness through your friendship, you can become a safe person that starts to break down those walls. Yes, Miss Vicky.
You mentioned a while ago that to those who are people helper, like you are helping people get out from trauma or
Yes.
just like us. So we also get not contaminated, but we also receive trauma from that. And how do you prevent that? How do you, uh,
Yeah, prevent secondary
yeah,
trauma.
secondary trauma?
So the opposite of trauma is beauty. So one very good thing is to fill your life with beauty, physical beauty, spiritual beauty, emotional beauty, even just having flowers in your room. And then also rest, right? So taking adequate wet rest and filling your life with beauty. But also a very helpful thing is understanding compassion fatigue and learning how to assess yourself to know when you are going too far and when you need to step back. I, for example, do a compassion fatigue assessment on myself every year and check if my work is intruding too much into my life, if it's affecting me too much. So that's like part of self-care. So that beauty, rest, and understanding how to recognize your own fatigue. I think that's all the questions.
I just have one last question.
Yeah.
You mentioned about neglect as a form of trauma,
Yes.
and it's such a kind of trauma that's so hard to be in touch with, for not having been fed, or not being sent to school, or not being given affection or care. How can one receive healing from a kind of trauma where he feels he's not being beaten or hurt?
It's very common with domestic abuse. Women who are in neglectful marriages often say, I wish my husband would just beat me because then people would understand, right? Neglect is hard. Part of the reason it's so hard is because you just internalize that you have no value, right? You just think I'm not worth it. Doesn't matter. I didn't deserve it, or and like with all things, sharing a story is helpful because what you want to do is find people in your life when you say, oh yeah, nobody ever cared for me, nobody fed me, nobody, I had to dress myself, no one asked me if I was okay, nobody said they loved me. Well, I love you. I'm going to walk with you here. I'm here if you want to talk, right? Those kind of things start our healing. But the hard thing about neglect is it's easier. So our brain develops like by stimulus, right? So if you are being beaten, your brain is growing. Maybe it's growing the wrong way, but it's growing, right? If you're being abused in some physical or sexual way, verbally, your brain is being stimulated and it's responding. It's responding the wrong way, it's growing the wrong way, but it's growing. And if it's growing, you can change it. The hard thing with neglect is there's no stimulus, so your brain doesn't grow. Right? So if you've experienced severe neglect, you end up being almost very emotionally stunted and socially stunted. So the growth process for that is definitely more difficult. If you've experienced severe neglect, I strongly recommend that you get in a support group, a very strong support group that can start helping you practice interacting in difficult situations and sharing your story. It's not something that's easy to recover from in one-on-one therapy. It's better to be with the community for that kind of recovery.
Thank you so much, Miriam. That's really enlightening and very helpful for us.